Have you ever stopped to think about what makes a city, well, unbreakable? We see them get absolutely shattered by war, leveled by natural disasters, but somehow almost every single time they come back. So today, let's dive into this incredible story of urban resilience. This isn't a new idea. Over 100 years ago, the poet Rudyard Kipling put it perfectly. He saw cities as this living, breathing force of nature that just refuses to die. This idea that cities can regenerate almost like a forest after a wildfire has fascinated people for generations. But is it just a nice piece of poetry, or is there something really deep going on here? Well, when you look at the actual data, it's pretty staggering. A huge study looked at the years between 1100 and 1800. A period filled with constant war, plague, the whole shebang. And in all that time, they found only 42 cities that were destroyed and then just permanently abandoned. 42. That's it. Think about that. Even cities that lost up to 90% of their people, like Baghdad or Moscow, they all eventually came roaring back. So that brings us to the big question, right? Why? What is this invisible engine that drives cities to rise from the ashes time and time again? Turns out the answer is this really interesting mix of human psychology, raw power, and some clever engineering. Let's break it down. Okay, first up, rebuilding a city isn't just about bricks and mortar. It's about rebuilding an idea. It's a powerful statement of identity, a defiant shout to the world that says, we are still here. Let's go back to 1814. The United States is this young, kind of fragile country, and British forces have just marched into its brand new capital, Washington, D.C. Now, what's really telling is what they chose to burn. They didn't just run around causing random chaos. Nope. They made a beeline for the White House, the Capitol building, the Treasury, the absolute symbols of American democracy. And just like that, with its most important buildings turned into burnt-out shells, the city's whole reason for existence was suddenly up for grabs. At the time, Washington was basically just a meager village surrounded by swamps. So you have to ask, why not just cut your losses and abandon it? And that's exactly the debate that exploded in Congress. A really powerful group was arguing, hey, let's just move the capital to Philadelphia or New York. Washington was a failed experiment. But for another group, abandoning the city would have been a massive national humiliation. For them, rebuilding was a test of the entire nation's character. But in the end, it wasn't just about patriotism. As always, you gotta follow the money. Local banks in Washington, totally panicked that they'd go broke if the government left, stepped up and offered this huge loan, $500,000, specifically to rebuild the public buildings. So this mix of national pride and good old-fashioned local self-interest did the trick. Washington was saved. Now, our second reason is a bit more complicated, maybe even a little darker. The idea of disaster as an opportunity. See, when a catastrophe just wipes the slate clean, a power vacuum is created, and the big question becomes, who gets to draw the new map? Just look at Warsaw right after World War II. The devastation was almost total. We're talking over 80% of the city was just gone. And this wasn't an accident of war. It was a cold, calculated Nazi plan to destroy monuments, libraries, historic buildings, to literally wipe Polish history and culture off the face of the earth. Faced with that, one of the very first things the Polish people did was this incredible act of defiance. Using old photos, pre-war paintings, anything they could find, they started to meticulously reconstruct their historic old town, brick by painstaking brick. It was their way of reclaiming a history that their enemies had tried to completely annihilate. But here's the thing. There was another, competing vision for those ruins. The new Soviet-backed communist regime also saw that rubble as a blank canvas, and they wanted to paint their own picture of a perfect socialist utopia on it. And this image, it just perfectly captures their plan. They didn't just rebuild, they totally reshaped the city. They carved out these massive, monumental avenues, perfect for military parades, and threw up these enormous, imposing socialist-style housing blocks. The reconstruction of Warsaw became this fascinating tug-of-war between two visions, one that looked to the past for its identity, and another that wanted to impose a brand new ideology to project its power. And we've seen this dynamic in other places too. After the Lebanese Civil War, the rebuilding of Beirut's city center was led by a private real estate company. And a lot of critics argue that this corporate plan prioritized a shiny, wealthy future,
but it pushed out the original residents and kind of created a political amnesia instead of real social healing.
All right, this brings us to our third reason, and this one is all about the modern world. Today, a city's real strength isn't just in its physical buildings, it's in the invisible connections, the networks of transit, communication, and finance that keep it alive. Okay, so here's a quick crash course in network theory. A centralized network, like a wheel with a hub and spokes, is super vulnerable. You take out that one central hub, and the whole system just collapses. A decentralized network is better, because it has a few different hubs, but the strongest, the most resilient, is a distributed network, where there's no single center, and everything is connected to everything else through a bunch of different paths. Now, let's apply this to the September 11th attacks. The World Trade Center wasn't just two tall buildings. It was a critical node in multiple networks. It was a hub for global finance, a key part of the region's transportation system, and as you can see here, it had this massive telecom antenna on top that served the entire city. So when that single critical node was destroyed, the ripple effects were immediate and massive. National phone traffic shot up 20% as New York cell networks just got jammed. Key subway lines that ran underneath the complex were completely severed. And of course, global financial markets had to be shut down. So the crucial lesson here is that modern city resilience isn't really about building stronger walls anymore. It's about building smarter networks. It's about designing our critical systems with backups, with redundancy, with decentralization, so that the failure of one piece of the puzzle doesn't bring the whole thing crashing down. So, we've explored these three really powerful forces that drive cities to rebuild: identity, power, and networks. But all of this brings us to a final, much deeper question about what recovery really truly means. We've seen it all, right? Cities rise again to express their cultural identity, like with Warsaw's Old Town. They're rebuilt to project political power, like we saw in Washington and in socialist Warsaw. And they're re-engineered to be stronger systems, which is the big lesson from 9/11. But is that the whole story? Well, the historian Edward Lenton-Hall points to something that often gets lost in these big, triumphant stories of rebirth. He calls it the toxic narrative. These are the private, painful stories of the survivors, the people who don't feel healed just because a new skyscraper goes up or a landmark gets restored. For them, the personal trauma and the loss, that remains, even as the city around them is celebrating its own comeback. And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. The resilience of a city is, without a doubt, a powerful, incredible force. But as we watch these skylines rise from the rubble, we have to ask ourselves, is the story of physical rebirth the same as the story of human healing? Thanks for joining this explainer.